Hello all, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for Cold War Spaces. Today's topic is Solidarity Space, East German Architecture in Vietnam. I'm so happy to welcome our guest, Christina Schwenkel. She's Professor of Anthropology and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Riverside, and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies, and a member of the editorial team of Roadsides. She works in the fields of Cold War cultural studies, critical urban theory, decolonization, affect theory, and new materialisms. She's the author of The American War in Contemporary Vietnam, Transnational Remembrance and Representation from 2012, and the recently published Building Socialism, The Afterlife of East German Architecture in Urban Vietnam by Duke University Press. Do you have that copy to show of the book?
There we go.
Oh, it's not quite showing.
It doesn't work like this. I don't know.
I think I might be able to get one. Here, I can show this one.
Perfect.
Yeah. Backwards.
We'll be discussing that today. She's a recipient of the Berlin Prize from the American Academy in Berlin, and her work has been supported by grants and fellowships from American Council of Learned Societies, National Endowment for Humanities, Fulbright Hays Program, German Academic Exchange Service, and the Venner Grand Foundation. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Christina and Yu Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for a Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time, and that's at the bottom of your screen. We appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them concise and no longer than a sentence or two so that we can try to get to everyone's. For other comments or discussion, please use the chat box. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi, and it's always nice to see what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud page. And I'd also like to mention this week's virtual Friday night film at the Wende, which is a suggestion from Christina called The Little Girl of Hanoi from 1974. So look out for the link for that. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and all of our virtual programs. And now Yus will get us started with the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Christina, welcome to Cold War Spaces. Great to have you in this series. May I start with a rather broad question? It seems that the last decade or so saw a spike in Cold War studies with a global perspective, also global architecture. Do you have an explanation why this global perspective all of a sudden became so popular?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here, and happy Lunar New Year to everybody who's joining us. Yeah, so great question. I think there are several answers to this question. First is a kind of gradual destigmatization and actually increasing kind of runophilia, I think, or fascination with socialist rooms over the past 10 years. I've seen this as well in the project. There's been an increase of interest in my work over time, and no longer just a kind of dismissal of the ideas about architecture and the socialist good life and the kinds of utopian visions of a good life that these projects offered. And I think temporally, there's also kind of enough distance now to allow for new paradigms and new ways of thinking to emerge. But I also think on the methodological level that access to new resources, new sources, archival, but also oral history. And I think there's also what I've seen personally, a decrease in the distrust that has accompanied the destigmatization, but there's also the emergence of a newly trained generation with new skills and who engage in multi-sited fieldwork like my own, and who are attentive to the subaltern voices that have been missing. And this is very much connected theoretically with the move to transnationalize socialist history, which until now has very much, in my view, remained bounded by the nation state. And I don't think it's just connected to architecture. I also think there's just broader questions being asked, especially about the relationship between the so-called second and third world, or the global socialist global north and the global south, and a kind of rethinking of the idea of the kind of non-racial society, and a kind of exploring of the ways in which that race and racial thinking was very much a part, which was always seen as elsewhere, right? And capitalism was very much a part of socialism. So there's more attention to the kind of constructions of the other is fundamentally different, and more attention to racial thinking and racism within presumably homogeneous societies, I would say.
Well, I think it's very refreshing and necessary, actually, that this traditional East-West divide determining Cold War discussions is being replaced with something more global and more all-encompassing. Also, I want to ask you, because most of my guests in this series so far have been historians or art historians, but you are an anthropologist. How would you characterize the difference in approach between a typical anthropologist and a typical historian, if something like that exists?
Yeah, yes, definitely does. But I think those barriers are also breaking down, especially with social historians. I do want to say that the book is an historical ethnography, right? And so the first two sections of the book are very much based on the history of warfare, and then the history of the kinds of utopian visions of recreating what was for Vietnam its first planned socialist city. Right. So that required a lot of archival work, but as an anthropologist, I also kind of approached archival work in thinking about, both subject as a kind of, the archive is a kind of place for the production of particular truths, but also as a site also for ethnographic observations. And that was particularly interesting, as a site for the exercise of state power, for example. So it was very interesting to me. I worked across, because it's a transnational project. It's also a 10-year multi-methods project that I did archival work in the United States. I did archival work in Germany, but fundamentally in archives in Vietnam, and previously inaccessible archives in Vietnam, mostly provincial archives that foreigners have not had access to before. And what emerged from that is this kind of the arbitrary nature of, for example, the classified data. So in one archive, there would be classified data I wouldn't have access to, but that same data I would be able to access kind of elsewhere. So that was the kind of anthropological approach I brought to the archives. But, the book is very much based on fieldwork. And what makes it unique is what we call in anthropology participant observation. So at the center of the book, it's a visual history of the buildings, the people who, envisioned the buildings, built the buildings, mostly women, by the way, and lived in the buildings and continue to live in the buildings after 30 years. There are also buildings that there are a host of presumptions that are attached to them, as there often are for ideas about modernism. And, of course, I was out there to kind of myth bust, to say, the least. And part of that entailed that I needed to move into the buildings. So I rented an apartment, a very small apartment in Block C2. I moved in and I became a part of the social life, the everyday life of, along with my Vietnamese neighbors. And this is an area of 1,500 households, and lived there for 9 months. And it was through living there 9 months that I, became very intimate with a number of families. I got to know the spaces of the 21 buildings very, very intimately by spending a lot of time inside of them, and also began to see how these ideas of rational planning actually worked out on the ground, and the extent to which then, not only that the planners themselves had appropriated and changed the original plans, but the ways in which people in their everyday lives had appropriated space and reconfigured their dwellings.
Right, thank you. So you start your book with the Vietnam War. First from an American military perspective, but then also from the experience of the Vietnamese people on the ground. And what would you say, before we focus on the content of the rest of your book, what would you say is maybe the most significant thing most Americans don't know about the Vietnam War?
Where to begin? Yes, I mean, that's been kind of my primary motivation of my work in Vietnam for over the past 20 years, right? How do Vietnamese people in very complex and diverse ways, officially and unofficially, commemorate the war? And how are those memories then transmitted through the built environment? So first and foremost, when it came to, so the book is a response to an exploration of the mass bombing of the city of Vinh, which is where I lived and worked and conducted this research over the past 10 years, and where I lived in the buildings for 10 months or 9 months. And so you learn a very different perspective on what it means from the history of the United States airstrikes. So I'll just give a kind of couple of examples. The project itself. So for example, if you're going to understand from the Vietnamese perspective, the aerial warfare, you have to abandon a lot of assumptions. For example, they have very different kinds of categorizations. They have very different time frames. In the United States, we discuss like aerial warfare in terms of 2 bombing campaigns, often Rolling Thunder and Operation Linebacker, right? I mean, those terminologies, for example, have no meaning on the ground in Vietnam. Many people think that the bombing campaigns began in 1965. They were suspended and then they resumed in 1972. That wasn't the case. There was no bombing halt for the cities and for people who were living beneath the 20th parallel. So the city in which I worked, Vinh, which was completely leveled, it was the most leveled city in northern Vietnam, was hit by over 5,000 airstrikes over a period of 10 years. Most of the population had been evacuated for that entire 10 years. It's a very different situation than some of the northern cities like Hanoi and Haiphong. But first and foremost, if you ask people about aerial warfare, they will also talk about that it began in 1964 and it ended in mid-1973. So very different kinds of temporal categorizations and ways of understanding the airstrikes as continuous and unrelenting.
Thank you. Yeah. So your book is about the work of East German architects and urban planners in Vietnam. And many people actually might be surprised that East Germans were active in Vietnam. What would you say was the main reason for the East German authorities to be engaged? Was it to show international solidarity? Were there direct political or economic interests involved, or was it just a genuine attempt to help people in need, or maybe a combination of all those factors? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really complex answer for that question as well, really multifaceted, because everything you just said is true, right? I mean, solidarity, of course, was the word that was used for what we might call today development aid, right? And, aid, but development was always associated with a kind of neo-colonial approach, right? So aid, the kinds of aid that was given, extended to Vietnam from not just GDR, but across CEMEA countries, right? Began in very much focused on modernization, focused on technical and material support. And aid, of course, is always political, right? It's about cementing alliances, like building alliances. And it was shaped by, of course, particular geopolitical frameworks of the time, the Cold War, right? What I think is very much it's interesting to kind of look at the ways of which, we talk about the Cold War, we talk about how it, in a place like Vietnam, it played out very much on the battlefields, but it also played out on construction sites. And I think that's one thing that the book can offer, that the kinds of ways in which, are you able to hear me? I see that my internet is unstable. Okay, I'm going to...
but the sound is perfect. So.
Okay, as long as the sound is going, I'm going to continue. So it was also about cementing alliances, building relations, but also about for the GDR political legitimacy, right? At a time when it was very much, fighting to establish its legitimacy, as a time when Vietnam was as well. It was also about securing resources and securing trade networks. For example, some of the projects were aimed towards, the later projects were aimed towards securing then access to coffee, for example. Right. But, beyond all this, there's also the humanitarian motivation that was driving the projects as well. And so I was very much interested in the agents, what I call in the book, the agents of solidarity. Who were the people who were involved in this work? What motivated them, right? What were their positionalities? What were their relationship on the ground? Some of them, some of the experts spent several months in Vietnam. Some of them stayed up to 7 years, right? It was a very different kind of project that played out. And I was then very much interested in how this project continues to hold value for people, both in Vietnam and also in Germany today. So very much focused as an anthropologist on the kinds of personal motivations and the desires and the ways in which people envisioned how they could make this kind of global contribution. We have to remember at this time, there were a lot of anti-colonial movements, right? So most of the people that I engaged with and interviewed and who were involved in these projects very much saw themselves as, you know, on board with these anti-colonial solidarity movements. Right. And that this could be their contribution, was to be on the ground alongside, you know, they had a way of like envisioning this as a kind of horizontal solidarity, right? Where they were beyond, you know, kind of post-racial horizontal solidarity, where it was about equality. This is very different than the Vietnamese were imagining it, by the way, where they're very much thinking it in terms of a hierarchy. We can get into that maybe a little bit later.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, it's very much about how people were positioning themselves as part of, as galvanized by the bombing and about all the, you know, the human rights violations that were taking place in Vietnam at the time. Many of the experts themselves have lived through the bombing of, you know, of Germany, very different reasons, but they tended to kind of bring those two together and see them as having what they would call a kind of shared history. You know, that's problematized in various sorts of ways in the book. And so that kind of human element was very much a part of what I was looking at in the text.
Yeah, I can imagine, yeah. So let's speak a little bit about the title of your book, Building Socialism, which I guess you can read in two ways, either referencing the production of socialist buildings, but also the development of a socialist society. And how do you see that those two things interact? What does in this case, East German architecture or urban planning contribute to a socialist way of living? Yeah, so very much it was thinking about how several levels here as well. First of all, that massed housing, you know, and this was summarized very nicely in an interview with one of the architects who was first involved with the project, when he said, you know, we weren't just in Vietnam to rebuild and to, you know, create new buildings. We were in Vietnam to create a whole new lifestyle, right? And so, but what that lifestyle meant, right? What that lifestyle meant for the kind of East German visions and of course for the Vietnamese visions were very incompatible in many sorts of ways. So mass housing was also about administering a population. The design of the housing allowed for example, easier surveillance, right, of the population. And it was also about, as I, you know, argue, it wasn't just a material project, it was also a civilizing project, right? And so part of it was to create this international proletariat. And the housing became very, you know, important infrastructurally. For example, by providing modern conveniences, that Vietnamese population that was mostly a rural population and the workers were predominantly women, that they would then have access to these modern conveniences in their home, which would lighten the domestic burden, which would allow for them to be more than productive at work, right? So it's very much about productivity and also social reproduction, right? And producing these kinds of new socialist men and women who also, you know, fashion themselves as modern global citizens. Right, but I could imagine that a socialist citizen means something quite different in an East German context than a Vietnamese context. So I'm actually curious to hear if there were any clashes between the ideas brought about by the Germans with Vietnamese traditions, Vietnamese conditions as well, and how the local architects with whom the East Germans were working responded to that. What was their participation in the process? What did they add to these plans? Yeah, okay. That's a great complex question I could talk about for an hour. So I'm going to just kind of summarize it very quickly. So in terms of the clashes, I do want to say one thing, that there was a way in which also people, this was very interesting too, before I get to the clashes, that they envisioned overlap between the various kinds of projects and visions of future building, right? What that future city might look like. For example, people very much praise, Vietnamese people and designers and officials very much praise the design of the large living settlement, right? Which was supposed to have about 35 buildings and house 15,000 workers. But they were quite critical of the design of the individual units. So, I mean, and so that's where there's these kinds of clash and the incompatibilities. We see that emerging. So for example,
Vietnamese residents and Vietnamese designers were very, very much impressed by the ways in which the GDR experts appeared to incorporate like feng shui into the design of the complex, right? Because they were very much about, and this of course goes back to scientific planning, right? They were very much like paying attention to kind of climate conducive architecture at that time, and able to perform and able to kind of channel ventilation, make these apartments more ventilated, to also to channel natural lighting, channel the winds. The buildings were staggered in sorts of ways so that it would contribute to more shade. They did a lot of green design at this time. And so, this is the entire complex. This fit very much in ways in which that they felt that the German experts at the time actually had been trained and knew a lot about feng shui. Now, of course they didn't, but it actually fit a lot with kinds of scientific, rationale of scientific planning at that time. Right. So these are the ways in which they intersected. When it came to the apartments themselves, people were quite critical of for a number of reasons. First of all, with the addition of the ways in which the wind moved through the house, the ways in which the doors were placed, the creation of walls, the gendering of space that hadn't been gendered before, the ways in which the whole concept was based on nuclear family, social organization based around the nuclear family, the movement of kitchens, for example, into the housing units, as well as toilets into the housing units, which traditionally have been outside and are outside for a reason, as they're seen as being polluting elements. And this comes into contact and conflict, for example, with very much so with ancestral worship, and the ways in which that families attempted then to set up their altars, for example. They weren't able to find spaces that didn't violate then feng shui. That did violate, that didn't fit with the kinds of principles of respect for their ancestors. There's also the ways in which the wind that was moving through, they were very well ventilated, but the ways in which the wind was moving unobstructed through the apartments actually contribute to ways of thinking about illness and health, right? And then in the ways of contributing to more illness than it should have. So there are all these different ways in which people kind of then went in and changed that space so that they could better accommodate their own ways of thinking. It was also very foreign for them to be living in these high-rise concrete block apartments, brick apartments. Yeah. So people had to do what they could. For example, blocking in the patios, they were given small balconies, and people turned them into places for raising livestock, for example.
Interesting. Yeah, that's not something you see every day in high rises in the West or in the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. So let's talk a little bit more about how people experience living here. You already made that connection, but so interesting to see in your book the very creative ways in which the buildings were actually appropriated. And one of the eye-catching elements there are the so-called tiger cases. Can you explain what these are and what function they had, and how they changed the buildings?
Yeah, so the so-called tiger cages, which has a very different terminology in Vietnam that does not reference the kinds of tiger cages that most Americans might associate with the prisons and torture in Con Dao Island in the South. So I just want to kind of place that out there first. The tiger cages were what people over time were able to build on. It's really important to think about, after the mass bombing, people were, in desperate need of housing. There was also, a lot of malnutrition. There was a lot of hunger. There's a lot of scarcity. So, having these buildings, even though they seem very foreign, a lot of people felt like they were forced to move into them. They were at the time, right, the only place and the kind of best housing offered, because there was no housing at that moment, right? Or there were thatched buildings that people could erect very quickly. And then exposed to the elements, and they were living many people in the room, etc. So in moving into the apartments, people started to kind of look at the space and see, like, how can we bring our own kinds of dwellings into these apartments? And one of them is that they focused on the patios, which they eventually could start to acquire bricks. They could collect some bricks, they brick them up, and then they turn them into kind of chicken coops. Well, after a while, people then use those patio spaces, very, very small, and we're only talking about like 3 square meters, where they would start to extend them. So then they started to add cages on them, and it was to expand space And the reason for the space changed over time as the political economy of construction materials changed over time, as well. And as more materials became available on the market that people could access, they started then to increase the size of them to the point of which when I was living there, people were building enormous structures that were almost as big as their apartments onto the back of the buildings, and they were designing them. And they were using them for very different sources of space. So the idea that at first they would be used for domestic space, hanging clothes up to dry, suddenly they became kind of like suites for newly married couples who would then move into the house. So the nuclear model, of course, didn't work. Vietnamese, expanded and had 3 generations within there immediately. And so the expanding of that space could, which, cost some people thousands of dollars to build onto the back of their houses. And they're actually quite nice. And they look like they're very precarious, but they're quite sound. They became kind of like suites for newly married couples. They became, as I talk about in the book, some of them became kind of like man caves where, men could then have their invite friends over. They're mostly retirees live there now. I've attended poetry readings in them. So they're very, very multi, some are gyms, people turn them into gyms, some turn them into computer rooms for their kids. So then they became this very interesting space in which people could express their kinds of middle class aspirations as well, while they are living in these buildings that were very decrepit. And it was a way in which that they could then, contribute to renovation of their homes.
Right. Fascinating, yeah. So to make a little jump in time, you mentioned that in guidebooks today, Vinh is described as the least attractive city in Vietnam. And you had a conversation with a Vietnamese planner in 2010 who said it used to be that when people traveled through this area from north to south or from south to north, they saw modernity. But today they see only filth. So my question is, what went wrong with this project? And since we are almost at the time that we move to the Q&A, let me also ask you, do you think that from the original utopian intent, are there still fragments left that are promising for a future orientation?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, what went wrong? Well, I developed this term, unplanned obsolescence, playing with the idea of the ways in which, capitalism and, capitalist architecture is kind of very much informed by this idea of creative destruction, right? Of planned obsolescence, so that the flow of capital is continuous, profit is continuous, and so you're replacing, that's what you build constantly. And so the idea behind a very different kind of temporality behind the socialist architecture, where the buildings were supposed to last for 80 years, right? They're supposed to be eternal. But they broke down very quickly, in a matter of years. So they decayed rapidly, and so that's what I term in the book the unplanned unplanned obsolescence, right? That really kind of called this idea of socialist progress into question. So the question of what went wrong, right? So then the buildings became kind of like this eyesore on the landscape very quickly, where they had been in the beginning, that which, as it was summarized to me, that which was at one point unimaginable, right? To have these kinds of modernist buildings on the landscape that most people, given that this had been a kind of rural backwater area, had never seen. So what went wrong? I was less interested in answering that question, what went wrong, than I was with hearing how people described what went wrong. And that's what was so fascinating to see, because obviously part of what went wrong is that there were no, as we have seen with other modernist projects, mass projects around the world, also in the United States, there was no money and no investments in maintenance, right? So the role of state neglect, right, is certainly a major, major factor. Now, when I talk to people living in the apartments, they had very complex ways of thinking about, well, who was responsible for maintenance? Well, of course, it was going to be East Germany should have been responsible. They built the buildings, they gave us the buildings. So, and we heard that they did leave funds for maintenance, but, there's corruption, so someone must have stole it. Well, but there is no more East Germany. Well, now it's Germany's responsibility to keep up these buildings. So there are all these ways in which people were, thinking about who's responsible. Also the state, but what was shocking to me most was the ways in which the women who built the apartment buildings, right? They were the construction workers. This was still a time at war when most men were at war. Women were also at war. They had different roles in war. So they were defending the city, right? They were also, the bearers of the nation, but they were also the rebuilders afterwards. And then they became the agents of decay. So they were then blamed as not having been or becoming urban enough. So they were, seen as kind of having failed as becoming socialist men and women. So it was very interesting to see how the workers, which were predominantly female migrant workers, then became blamed for the decay. In some sense, so the state played a role, but it also very much focused on the practices of women who didn't behave properly and didn't know how to live in, this is, I heard this over and over, didn't know how to live in a modern building and didn't know how to use modern infrastructure. So they ultimately contributed to its, so it's, unplanned decay.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Christina. We are going to the Q&A. Please, if you have questions, put them under the Q&A box, not the chat, because that's where I'm going to look. We already have one question from Elizabeth Dunn. You talk a little bit about how people had to move into Vink's apartment blocks from the countryside. How did rural-urban relations shape the way the apartments were used? Were practices from the village brought into the urban environment? And how did that change the way the socialist city was inhabited?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hi, Elizabeth. Yeah, that is so complex too. And, that was another thing of why, standing on the outside of the buildings and just seeing them as kind of uniform and spaces of alienation, which is just so wrong. Getting inside the buildings, I did a mass survey of the buildings because I realized I have to get to know every building in this complex. And that's when I was able to see that, the buildings were supposed to be allocated to workers. And the East German experts were very adamant, even in my interviews, most recently, that no, they were given to workers, they were given, but of course they weren't. So I was able to see which buildings were actually given to workers, allocated to workers, and it was allocated through their work units, right? Because that was how, the social organization of society at that time. And then they were allocated to cadres and intellectuals. So, we were able to map out which of the buildings went to cadres and intellectuals, more professionals, and then which buildings went to workers. And the buildings that went to workers were predominantly up to 80%, and some of them allocated to women, who are now the owners of the apartment. So that's an interesting kind of side story. And the women were predominantly from rural areas. So they were seen as then bringing their kinds of, backwards rural, habits to the buildings. And so all these poems that they started writing, which are really fascinating about the buildings, were also just about, how they struggled to kind of bring in this kind of rural ways, their rural forms of dwelling, and to kind of unite them in this, bring that to these kinds of very alienating for them in terms of the apartments themselves. And part of that meant, for example, keeping doors open. Nobody shut doors. Part of that meant, even though they weren't supposed to be shouting and being loud, was being as loud as they always had been in the village. That is, from shouting from one apartment to the next, shouting from up or down. So there are ways in which that they kind of just changed the space and used the communal space that hadn't been intended. So East German architects very much were about clear boundaries, right? That was functionalist planning, especially between public and private. That just made no sense to people who were living in the buildings. So that would be one sense. The urban professionals were very proud to be in the buildings. They very much saw themselves as modern cosmopolitans, and many of them had been trained overseas in Eastern Europe, especially in Germany. So for them, the buildings very much signified that they could show themselves to be modern. They had these modern subjectivities. Whereas for the rural migrants, the female rural migrants, they really never developed that kind of way and attachments to thinking of themselves or wanting to think of themselves as modern in relationship to the buildings themselves. Their kind of ways of thinking of them of modern were as modern workers in these modern day factories, as these kinds of ways of international proletariats who had participated in this global project of building socialism alongside East Germany. Right.
We have another question that goes into the gender aspect from Theodora Dragostinova. Could you elaborate on the gender dynamics of the process? You mentioned many of the East German architects were women, so it would be lovely if you could tell us more.
Oh, okay. Was that last question? Many of the East German architects were women?
That's what it says.
Oh, okay. So let me clarify. I'm sorry if that was, if I had said that. No, not the architects were women, the construction workers. So the people who did the physical manual labor, brick by brick, laying brick by brick, those were women. So the construction workers were women. The women working in all elements of manual labor of producing the construction materials were vast majority, to 86% in most of the fields were women. Again, that had to do a lot with men being out in the field, but women have historically been in Vietnam part of, the workers of infrastructure and doing a lot of the infrastructure labor. If you were to go to Vietnam today and look at who's building roads, they're women. Women are predominantly doing that labor. So the gender division was very interesting too, because the almost all of the East German architects and experts, they were experts across fields of crafts as well, and tradespeople, because this was a very holistic project. You're not just building buildings, you're building schools, you're building factories. You have to have then, craftspeople on site, wood makers or wood people to be building then the desks and, et cetera. So there are multiple ways in which people who at various different professional levels came together to create this infrastructure. And most of those professionals were men, and they were mostly training and working with professionals, Vietnamese professionals, who are also designers and planners. Vast majority were men, not all, but vast majority. And a lot of them had been sent then to East Germany to get their training there. And the goal had been that they would then come back and that the kinds of training would be self-sustainable, but then that you would have this developed skilled labor force of women who would continue to be able to build the city, expand the city, and then you would have planners and designers, predominantly who were men, but not only men. I also worked with several women. They had not been sent overseas. So that's really where the gender division of labor occurred, that you had the kind of training of the architects and the professionals who were men, and that the manual laborers were women.
Right. There is a question from Hiltrud Schultz that relates to this point. Can you talk more about the collaboration between East German and Vietnamese architects? How was the work shared or organized? I know you already talked about this. Are there any other aspects you want to add to this? Or do you consider this already answered?
Yeah, I have something I can add to that I think might be interesting to add to that question to answer. One thing that everybody made clear to me, and that I also found in the archives, and that was good to find in the archives that kind of complement what people were claiming, because most of the East German experts that I got to know and who I interviewed and still stay in touch with today, always kept going back to this idea that, we were there, as coaches. We had no role in the final decision. We would produce these plans, we would put them forward, and ultimately the Vietnamese officials, Vietnamese planners and designers, they made the ultimate decisions on how they wanted to build the city. And this was their way of kind of showing that their form of solidarity was very much not going to reproduce colonial hierarchies as Western development aid had been doing, right? And so this ways in which it was kind of this kind of enabling, this ideology of enabling. So the ultimate power, I would hear over and over, would lay in the hands of Vietnamese officials. And so I was able to kind of gather all different kinds of plans and ideas that they put forward, and then to see the ways in which that Vietnamese planners and especially officials then went through those plans, rejected, majority of them, and then what plans that they accepted, and then how the most interesting part was how Vietnamese authorities then went through and changed those plans, because they saw them, they saw very much, or they accused East German experts of being very much kind of embedded in this bourgeois socialism. So many of the plans just did not fit at that time the the material realities of people's everyday lives. So, but there was then a lot of conflict, because then certain East German planners pushed back a bit, right? So for example, they wanted to have one family per unit. Many Vietnamese officials were saying, we need to house as many people as possible. We can't be thinking of the socialist good life now, right? We can't be thinking about consumerist desires, and they're actually quite suspicious of that idea of the role of consumption in East German society. Again, that they saw as too bourgeois. I remember they're also balancing between like the Soviet Union and China, right? So Vietnam is being pulled into kind of a model more towards China, which is more kind of thinking communally and less individualistically at that moment as well. So there are ways in which they were negotiating, and that there was pushback from the East German side saying, if you're going to double the number of people, so the Vietnamese officials doubled the number of people and took the plans per house per nuclear family and divided those apartments for two families per apartment. You know, there was pushback from the East German side saying those apartments are going to crumble more quickly, right? And they also knew the limitations, you know, structural capacity. But in the end, the Vietnamese, you know, planners and officials made their own decisions and did follow through with their own plans.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot more questions and not much time left. So Christina, if possible, try to keep your answers concise. The next one is from Ken McLean. In what ways, if at all, did your ethnographic work in the archive change as you moved between archives in the US, East Germany, and Vietnam?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, like I had said at the beginning of the talk, it was very interesting. First of all, there are a lot of contradictions. You know, I think that's, you know, we expect that, and that's why it's really so important that we carry out archival work, if we're going to work in archives, that we carry out kind of archival work, you know, across in different kinds of countries and different kinds of contexts. I also worked a lot though in the photographic archives. That was very useful as well. And also just paying attention to, like I said, the ways in which certain documents have not only have access to, but could actually visit in the stacks. In certain places I was allowed to visit in the stacks to kind of see also the organization behind the archives. And also very interesting in terms of the ways in which I was given access to photographing the archives. Whereas other places, you know, as we know in Europe, you're not allowed to bring in a camera. In most places, right, especially in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, you're not allowed to bring in a camera, right? You have to go through a kind of whole process. So that process changed as across scales. So as I moved into the provincial, especially when I was working in the Nghệ An provincial archives, and was basically, you know, given the files open for me to then kind of photograph, and then for my own self to create that kind of archive.
Right. Thomas Neumann asks, do you know if the experience of German housing ideas were adopted in projects later on in Vietnam? Or was it seen as failed projects?
Yeah. So this project is very unique because it looks, I mean, there are in Vietnam, they're called hutabte, these collective housing, you know, establishment, or, you know, microrayon is a term that's often used in Eastern European studies. So there are different kinds of microrayon or hutabte in Vietnam, most of which in Hanoi. They're quite distinct. They're very, very different. For example, they didn't apply the kinds of wind science, or the so-called feng shui principles to their design. So they're, and I did some work when I was in Hanoi, then I spent a lot of time meeting with families who lived in those hutabte as a comparative study to look at the kinds of ways in which the space was designed, the ways in which natural lighting and ventilation was or was not incorporated into design. So they're entirely different, and people often use then the buildings in Vinh as this kind of like romanticization of what the buildings could have looked like had there been proper design and better design in Hanoi. And I heard that constantly also, not only from residents in the housing complex who were aware of the housing complex in Nghệ An, central Vietnam, but also from the architects themselves, right? They had seen this project as kind of like, you know, the flagship project of what collective housing could actually be.
Right. So it's time, but let's do one final question, which is from Susanna Altman. A few days ago, I read an article in the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta praising Germany for its present preservation of block buildings. The rediscovery of those buildings and quarters as convenient and even trendy today was cited as a role model for how to treat the Soviet Khrushchevki in today's Russia, rather than tearing them down.
Yeah, interesting.
And the question is, has this message spread to the respective circles in Vietnam too?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so what's very interesting, That's a great question. And yeah, I mean, what I was totally, so I have to say that in you know, within these housing complex in Bing, 60% of the population who were originally allocated apartments still continue to live there, which is quite high compared to the ways in which that the apartment complexes in Vietnam, built at the same time, much lower quality, very different, and people have kind of moved in and out over the years. So they 60%, so part of the survey that we did was, who would, you know, do people want to rebuild? Because they were being privatized and subjected to demolition when I was doing the research. The question of demolition. So huge question was, should they rebuild? And would you move into the new buildings, or would you like to have them preserved? Of course, they're crumbling and they're decaying, and you assume people are going to say that they want to have new buildings. But over 66% of the population said we want to preserve them. And when I asked them why you would want to preserve them, and there were actually people who were trying to turn them and working at that time to turn these buildings into architectural heritage. And part of that was because of this, but for people there and also in Germany, which was a very important kind of chapter in international solidarity. But also because people feel that they live in the best buildings. So they have, you know, these high rises that are going up all around, right, these East German made buildings, which actually scale is quite different. I mean, they're just dwarfed now. And, you know, they're crumbling. And so you ask, like, why are these, you know, they say these are the most stable buildings. All these kind of high rises that are being built with Vietnamese investment and according to Vietnamese management are actually low quality. And we want to keep our buildings because, as they say, they're quote unquote German made.
Right. Okay, Christina, I want to thank you very much for a very rich and fascinating conversation.
Thank you for the questions. And thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the work. Really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. This was great. And I apologize, as I often do, for answers that could not be questions that could not be answered because of the time. Next week, we have our next Cold War Spaces interview with Alison Blakely, Emeritus Professor of European and Comparative History at Boston University. We are going to talk about singer, actor, athlete, and civil rights activist Paul Robson and his life and career between the East and the West. So I think quite fascinating as well. And I hope to see you back next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks everyone for coming.